Hey, everybody. As recruiters, we know that hiring can be one of the most challenging parts of running a business. Whether you're a startup looking to build a dream team or a well established company aiming to streamline your recruitment process, the right tools can make all the difference. Teamtailor is a powerful all in one recruitment software your candidates and team will love. It's not just a way of software. Hey, everybody. As recruiters, we all know that hiring can be one of the most challenging parts of running a business. Whether you're a startup looking to build a dream team or a well established company aiming to streamline your recruitment process, the right tools can make all the difference. Teamtailor is a powerful, all in one recruitment software your candidates and team will love. It's not just a piece of software, but a way of working. With Teamtailor, you get everything you needed all in one place: powerful analytics, an AI assistant, customizable workflows, powerful integrations, and so much more. Plus, Teamtailor is easy to use and implement with their intuitive, user-friendly interface. 94% of their users report better team collaboration, and 97% see an increase in qualified candidates. If you're focused on the candidate experience, CX is at the heart of the ATS. Just ask any of the 4 million candidates who connect with customers every month. Join the ranks of over 150,000 recruiters and more than 8,500 companies like Oatly, Porsche, and OneFlow who have transformed their recruitment with Teamtailor. Discover the new way to attract and hire top talent and see the results for yourself. Hey, everybody, you're tuned in today for a special edition with Ben Sesser. Ben is the co-founder and CEO of Brighthire. What's up, Ben?
How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for coming on.
Of course. My pleasure.
Well, Brighthire's definitely taken the recruiting space by storm. You've been an avid poster, seen your face around the conferences, doing your own community. What is Brighthire all about for folks that might not be familiar at this point?
Yeah, so Brighthire, we've been around since 2019, and we help companies like Canva, Rippling, Zapier, up to Fortune 100 companies like HCA Healthcare, basically improve the quality and the efficiency of their hiring process, specifically the interview process, using AI. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm happy to go deeper, but yeah, we've been around for a while, and it's been a fun journey.
Awesome. When I think about interviewing, a few years back, video interviewing like one way was a thing. How is Brighthire's interview transcription different from, say, those tools that some organizations in technology were using 5, 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, totally different paradigm. Brighthire came from my own experience. So before Brighthire, I was at a couple scaling venture-backed companies, and in the most recent one, I was leading people and talent for a while. And it was really evident that, growing from a couple dozen people to 250, hiring was the most important thing we did for our success. I was also the CFO, and it was also clear that hiring was the biggest way we allocated capital in the business. So it was most important thing for our success long term, biggest place we allocated capital. And the process itself, the hiring process, it was really clear that there was a lot of opportunity for improvement. And specifically in the part of the process that drives the two biggest outcomes, which are efficiency and quality. And that's the interview process. We spend an enormous amount of time interviewing and going through the interview process, and those conversations and the decisions on the back end of those basically drive every hiring outcome. And so Brighthire was built to address that. So as opposed to being, a one-way or an asynchronous interview that a candidate takes because you get, an enormous amount of applicants and you're just trying to essentially make the very top of the funnel more efficient and kind of filter them down before they enter the interview process. Brighthire is technology that's actually built for the interview process itself. And, our initial value proposition was somewhat simple, but important and valuable, which is essentially, these are really important conversations. When I say these, I mean interviews. And so it would be really helpful if we didn't forget them and could be completely focused on the candidate and sort of giving them our undivided attention while we're running them so that we can get the most out of the limited time we have with candidates and make more objective and better hiring decisions. So that's kind of where we started. Let's capture those conversations so that we can be focused on the candidate, make good decisions, and start to learn about our process.
That's awesome. Well, just to be transparent, like A, Brighthire is not capturing insights from this conversation, and B, Ben is not paying me to talk about the product today. So when we think about how the product has evolved and moved from like an ops tool, call transcription, to a hiring and talent interviewing intelligence tool, That to me is fascinating because in my mind, I think a lot of folks in the market perhaps like bucketed Brighthire into like this ops tool. And I'm sure that's a question you get, like, how is it different from all of the other call recording tools out there? What's your perspective on like why building a recruiting native type of tool like that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been pretty clear from day zero that, we're building a product for hiring. And the reason we're doing that is because we're really passionate about it. I was a labor relations major. I've been in the people space my whole career. My co-founder has as well. We've always wanted to solve problems around hiring because it's really important for every organization. And it's really important for candidates. And so with that in mind, we never viewed what we were doing as sort of an ops tool. We were always thinking about how do we deliver product, how to deliver technology basically that helps recruiting teams be empowered to scale excellence. And so even from early on, we had insights in the product and we're giving visibility and even from day zero, our earliest clients were using it for things like interviewer enablement and training and understanding what's happening and coaching people on their pitch and how they sell the company and all sorts of things. So that's been kind of our DNA from day one. Now, as we've continued to build the product and got more sophisticated in the technology, the platform is just much broader than where we started, which was, how do we improve interviews? First, we added sort of this idea of like, we can bring your structured interview, your structure, if you have structure in your hiring process, into the meeting, right? So you join an interview with Brighthire and we can bring the questions, the guide, the competencies front and center. The idea is let's make life easy for interviewers to be great. Let's take their, capture the interview for them. Let's give them their guide. Then we added insights on the back end and those have gotten really sophisticated. And now it's much broader. We can talk about that, but it's really how do we basically plan an exceptional interview process, hiring process, and then scale it like day in, day out, across hundreds or thousands of interviewers to drive like really important outcomes.
I appreciate that you mentioned the candidate perspective early in this conversation. Do candidates have the ability to opt out of having their interviews recorded?
Totally. Yeah, it's really, really important. So as much as we built on the front end of the product, I would say we put probably equal investment into what I call like the back end. And that's two main things. One is integration. So the product is built to meet your team where they work. It's not another thing to go to. So it's, we join Zoom meetings and team meetings and email, and we have Slack integrations and really deeply embedded in the ATS and all that. So it's super important because again, we can't have impact if we don't meet people there. And then similarly, the compliance side and the kind of the control side. So really, really granular. And part of that is always putting the candidate in control, as we like to say. We're candidates first. It's one of our first values. So the candidate is notified ahead of time, really, really important, can opt out ahead of time. And then from there, everything is sort of automated. If a candidate decides, they prefer not have their interview in Brighthire, more power to them. That's sort of certainly their right. And then the system kind of understands and doesn't show up and notifies everybody. Yeah, it's a really important part of, our mission. And so it's really important to give the candidate total control before and actually during the interview as well.
I would assume then you've got a massive data set on when the product is used and also when it is not used.
Yeah.
Do you have any data on hiring success rate of candidates at some of these companies that choose to opt out of having their interviews recorded?
Yeah. We've done the analysis for clients. We have clients that are a lot of companies. So for context, we work with few hundred companies today at the enterprise level. So not the individual user level, like these are companies that are using Brighthire across the company. And many of those are large or public or international. And so with those types of organizations, there's a ton of time that we spend with them, kind of walking them through, the compliance side and also doing data analysis with them around, what's the impact of using Brighthire? Is there an adverse impact on folks that opt out? Is there an adverse impact across different candidate pools? And the answer is no. And what we see is there's some other really, really powerful stats that we have. Like we did a study across 25,000 candidates, and we found that the candidate withdrawal rate went down 20%, just shy of 20% once a company started using Brighthire. So they started using Brighthire, and 20% fewer candidates were withdrawing voluntarily from the process. So to answer your first question, no, we haven't seen any disparate kind of impact on ability to be successful in the hiring process in those cases. The opt-out rate historically is really, really low across our client base, and that's like across geos and types of roles. We support everything from really high volume to super C-level and sort of professional hiring environments, but we don't see kind of a distinction in terms of the outcomes when folks do opt out, but very few folks, on a percentage basis do.
When you think about the number of touch points it takes to get a candidate hired, how many call recordings are on average in, say, a candidate's file?
Yeah, it's a good question. So that will vary a lot from organization to organization, but I can tell you one of the data analyses we did, which kind of speaks to this, is we looked at about 24 clients, and across those 24 clients, we looked at like 25,000 candidates, and then we looked at basically roles that these organizations were hiring for prior to using our product, and the same roles post. So trying to get as close to apples as possible of like what is the impact. And one of the things that we saw was essentially the number of interviews to get to every individual hire. So if you think about, to make one hire, you're going to do X number of phone screens and, Y hiring manager screens, and then X number of on-sites, and you add all that up into a number of interviews. Maybe it's 25, maybe it's 30. We were basically able to reduce that by like 27%, so almost 30% fewer interviews. Now, part of that, is let's make the interview loop shorter. Let's have less redundancy. Let's not make the candidate have to talk to as many people. The impact from that perspective is not going to be the same organization to organization, because some organizations may already have a tight interview process. Others have an exceptionally long interview process. Obviously, if you have an exceptionally long one, there's a huge opportunity to make it less redundant and consolidate it and be more efficient. But it also, the impact of sort of reducing the overall number of interviews needed to get to a hire is also from like better calibration, being more structured and knowing what you're looking for, less false negatives. So less instances of someone saying like, well, I don't know, I'm not a yes, and then nobody else was in the interview and doesn't know how to interpret the feedback and can't say, well, actually, I appreciate the feedback, that's coachable. So all of those things together kind of make the process more efficient. But part of it is definitely sort of fewer touch points per candidate or fewer interviews per candidate, particularly if the organization already has a long loop.
You mentioned being in like the recruiting and talent and people space for your career. So we can be honest, hiring managers can be difficult at times. Recruiting is not very glorified. What do you think the presence of just being on a recorded call does, and the presence of surveillance in being on someone's best behavior as an interviewer? Do you think there's an element of that compliance there that boosts credibility on the platform?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's both. I think one of the things that's great about a platform like Brighthire, which is not necessarily the case for sort of all recruiting technology, actually most, right, is we're really widely used. Like when I was referring earlier that we have hundreds of clients, we're used at the enterprise level. I was just on a call with a client. It was like Friday. They have 560 active users of Brighthire. They're using Brighthire weekly. They're interviewers, they're hiring team members. And for all of them, we make their life easier, right? So yes, I believe that using Brighthire, drives excellence in every interview and systematically every interview, because you're kind of more dialed in. You're actually able to be more dialed in as well, right? Because you could kind of free yourself up to listen and focus on the candidate. But you also, there's visibility. Very similar to sales, right? Where there's other, tools that have been around for a long time that, they capture sales calls and they help free, sellers up to be more focused. They save them time, but they also provide an element of enablement and coaching and visibility and data. And so, yes, I think that does have an impact at the individual interview level, like getting hiring managers or interviewers to be dialed in. And then systematically, we're giving really powerful insights to companies about, we released, we have a lot of insights, but we actually released a capability, maybe a quarter or two ago, that we call like an interview quality score, where actually our clients can define what a great interview looks like at their organization using a bunch of metrics that we capture, turn it into a rubric, like a North Star, and actually track it over time, track it for the whole company, track it in the department, and so that gives them the ability to lean in and coach and enable and know where there's opportunities where folks need to be upskilled. So it does have an impact on quality. I do think that the fact that it's recording from multiple dimensions gets interviewers to be on their toes and their best behavior, but also frees them and saves them time. So it's not just punitive; it's also a huge relief. Like interviewers, hiring teams love Brighthire. We save them tons of time. So it's not just a stick; it's a carrot and a stick, I guess. Yeah.
And I appreciate you mentioned rubric when you released, I think, the first competency-based interview question bank maybe like 18 months ago for, I forget what role, it
Yeah.
might have been a customer success role or something. That was the first thing I did with it, was ripped it into a rubric system for like proper leveling. Because I think a lot of the times when you're interviewing folks, it's, are we assessing for the right level within the role? So I appreciate that you mentioned rubrics and accountability and training with hiring managers. That's a big piece of the puzzle because hiring is a team sport. When I think about using Brighthire as an interview intelligence tool, is Bright recording like coding practicums and mock sales presentations and demos, some of those skills assessment portions of the interview loop?
Yeah, totally. When you mentioned engineering and sales, I would say of all functions, those are probably like the most common on our platform. And huge percentages of the engineering interviews on our platform are live coding, code assessments, a huge percentage of, there's always a lot of mock sales calls or mock demos on the sales side. So yeah, we do capture sort of all types of interviews, inclusive of those, on the platform.
I tuned into the webinar, I think it was last week, and Teddy said something about like skills-based hiring versus traditional hiring. How do you define skills-based hiring and what is traditional hiring?
Yeah, I think about skills-based hiring as focusing on evaluating and assessing for, the skills, the competencies, sort of the core foundations that somebody needs to be successful in a role, as opposed to relying on, essentially proxies for qualifications, things like education or past jobs or years of experience. And so I think those tend to be things folks fall back on as a screen, but ultimately the idea is to shift assessment, shift our mindset to be more, does this person have the foundational tools, capabilities to do a job successfully, regardless of what their educational background, regardless of what roles they've had before, and trying to strip away as many of those things as possible, because ultimately it's beneficial for a few reasons. One, not everyone's going to go through the traditional backgrounds, have the traditional educational background or career background, and so you want to open the aperture to opportunity for more folks. And if you're actually focusing on, does somebody have the skills and capabilities to do a job, you do that. Secondly, for a lot of roles and for a lot of parts of the economy, there's going to be a gap, right? We're not going to have enough folks who have the traditional background or come through the traditional channels. And so it allows you to also open the aperture to a much wider candidate pool. So that's the shift. Assessments are one way to do that. You mentioned like code assessments, like that's a version of skills-based hiring, right? Do you have the capabilities or skills to do this job? But ultimately, the interview process is driving, most outcomes in many organizations. And so if you're not kind of bringing that lens into the interview process itself, then it's kind of hard to execute skills-based hiring.
And so I'm tracking correctly when you're saying traditional hiring to you, that's specific degree requirements, number of years of experience at a specific organization.
Yeah, and I think the traditional interview process or the interview process very often in many organizations is not quite as structured, right? It's not quite as competency and skill focused. It's not as sort of, specifically planned to assess for the things that are most important for the role in every interview in a really structured way, in a really objective way. And so pushing the interview process in that direction is a really important step to take if you want to be skills based and structured and more objective, and not fall back on either heuristics that speak to qualifications or, feel and gut and, vibe, which, for better, I think mostly for worse, is a part of a lot of hiring processes, and in many cases is the process, right? It's, does this person have a bunch of proxies for the right, qualifications, and does it feel like they would be a fit? We want to move more towards, do they have the tools to be successful? And are we evaluating for that in an objective and kind of consistent way?
One of the things that caught my attention was when you posted that Brighthire is doing this for the first time and making skills-based hiring achievable. What do you think recruiters were doing before? And do you think outcome-based job descriptions and interview plans existed before this epiphany?
It's less around what recruiters were doing before, but it's about scaling kind of this structured and sort of skills or competency focused process at scale day in, day out, right? That's the real gap. It's not that, TA teams weren't focused on how do we identify what's important for a role and try to build an interview process or a plan to assess for those things. That's not new. What is new is actually going from this is what we want to do, this is the plan, to kind of ensuring that it actually happens day in, day out across, the hiring team at scale across time, right? The hiring process is, the most important process in the company, in my biased opinion, in terms of the organization's future success. And it's the only kind of really important process that's largely staffed by an army of volunteers that only do it sometimes. And it's hard, which is a kind of a tough recipe for success. So when you can make it easy to not just actually create a great plan and have it be really focused, but actually make that plan show up day in, day out, and then sort of frame the interview process and the evidence that you're collecting around that structure and make it part of the hiring decision automatically, that really changes the game in terms of actual execution on a structured and consistent hiring plan, as opposed to we build a plan and then we don't know, right? That plan has to show up. People have to actually assess for those things. Then we have to try to gather feedback in a way that is structured against the things that matter and make decisions around it. It's really hard to scale. And we're trying to make that much, much, much easier to do. And I think we're being successful.
When I think about end-to-end skills-based hiring, something you've talked about, I think about tying in post-hire outcomes and the skills, competencies, and attributes, both hard and soft skills of top performing employees, and bringing that into the candidate interview process.
Yep.
Is Brighthire a people analytics platform?
I don't think we would be defined as one today, but what we are now measuring is we're able to basically gather data on the assessment process that didn't exist before, that I think could be really, really powerful for, to your point, connecting to outcomes and closing the loop. And we've actually done that work with some of our clients, meaning we've looked at, okay, what do we think was important for this role? Who assessed them? What do we assess for or not? Like, what did we cover or not cover? How deeply, right? What were the kind of the rankings or scores given by these interviewers? Like, there's this big mass of data, some of which you've had historically, like feedback scores or who interviewed them, some of which you didn't, which is like, what do we actually assess for or not? How deeply do we assess for, and so on and so forth. And then we've taken basically outcomes data. This is a candidate pool of folks that we hired that we deemed were successful. These were folks that weren't as successful, and what can we learn from that? So we are gathering a lot of data that our clients are now able to use to sort of do that retro in a way that, they weren't able to before, or they didn't have all of the data that we captured before, which I think is really, really powerful and we're quite excited about. But I don't think I would call us, a people analytics platform. We're a hiring intelligence platform, and we have a lot of, I think, really, really powerful data that helps optimize the interview process and the hiring process and allows you to close the loop on quality, but we're not in of ourselves.
What do you think about selecting the right buckets of skills or competencies to define success? There are literally thousands of models and definitions, and there's no universal definition or governing body to defining the successful skills and competencies and traits.
You mean post-hire, or like as you're building the plan and figuring out how to, what you're going to hire for, what's the role and what matters and what should we assess for?
The whiteboard thesis is like future state magic wand. We've got 10 high-performing software engineers. Let's audit the skills and competencies that make them great and tie that into our hiring process. So when I think about defining those skills, there's no universal definition for those skills themselves, and it actually gets into psychology. So can you talk a little bit about the role of the skills that are selected as being strong signal to make a hiring decision?
Yeah, so there's two pieces. There's how do we define up front what matters, like what we're going to evaluate for, and then there's how do we analyze the folks that have been hired and we think have been successful and sort of work backwards from them and what makes them great to understand what we should hire for in the future. On the first piece, the role that Brighthire plays, so we have a whole product around interview planning. So it's how do we, we're hiring for a role, how do we figure out what we want to assess for, express that to the market, build an interview plan around that. Today, Brighthire does not bring a methodology that's going to push you in one direction or another. What we try to do is equip the recruiting team and hiring managers with basically a series of selections, thoughtful selections to have them make conscious choices. So if the current state for many organizations is we're hiring for, I don't know, a senior director of demand gen, and we're going to go find some other job descriptions on the internet, put it in ChatGPT, and sort of just like ask what matters. Brighthire's approach is we're going to give you a workflow that's going to give you a set of choices to make about, tell us a little about the role, and we're going to give you a set of, responsibilities, competencies, traits, and then as you make choices, we're going to keep going a click deeper and saying, okay, well, let's clarify. If this responsibility at a high level is something you think is really important for this role, let's get more specific about what that means. So we're essentially taking folks through a set of conscious choices as opposed to it being, the previous state, which was not a set of conscious choices and sort of whatever they got from, job descriptions they're borrowing, ChatGPT. That's the role we play today. In terms of looking at successful hires and coming back to, okay, what made them successful and how do we make that in the process? I mean, that's work that, the consultancies have done for a very long time. I worked at a company called Corporate Executive Board, which is now part of Gartner, and we would do these huge Salesforce surveys. And the idea was we're going to survey, your 1,000-person sales team, and we're going to have them essentially take tests and understand, what are their strengths, what are their, weaknesses, what are their personalities, and then you're going to give us the performance data of that sales force, and then we're going to try to use that data and analyze and understand, are there any common denominators between your most successful hires? That's been done for a long time in a lot of different spaces. We don't do that today. We don't bring that capability or that point of view into sort of like measuring post-hire success. But it's really interesting analysis, and folks have been really successful for a long time trying to do that work and then replicate it back into the process. Ultimately, the role that we're going to play is say, can you learn something about how you assessed for those folks and were there big differences or factors that seem to be really different in the way that you assess for sort of the folks that end up being more or less successful? And if you do, do that outcomes research and you do have things that you've identified that are important, let's bake that into the hiring plan, but then make sure that gets executed on day in, day out in the process, as opposed to we have a new hiring profile based on this really fancy analysis we've done, but we don't actually know if anybody's, we don't know if that plan is actually being put into action and if anyone's actually following the plan or, the decisions we're making are actually reflect the process and the skills that we identified are important in the first place.
One response there, and then we can go back to the first part about the ChatGPT project, is what do you think the role of divergent skill sets is within a team?
It depends on the role, right? It depends on the role. But yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's really important to have, particularly a team where it's folks coming together and collaborating to get to an outcome, that you have divergent skill sets, complementary backgrounds and points of view. Like the data is clear that gets to better outcomes, period. Now, not every role has that, construct, right? I think sales is a good example where there are, in a certain environment, common denominators that are going to make folks successful. And, if you're hiring at scale, optimizing and identifying for those are really important, particularly if you can actually prove out that those are indeed traits that make folks successful. So I think generally speaking, is that kind of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. The other piece is the use of LLMs in all of this. You describe Brighthire being able to bring forward those options. First question is is OpenAI the API call for the LLM? And second to that is it sounds a lot like service as a software, so being able to on the back end provide some of the workflow efficiency that recruiters would do manually in the way you described it, plugging a JD into ChatGPT.
We did not build our own LLM from scratch. We use the major providers. Well, I can't get hyper specific beyond that, but certainly OpenAI is one of the partners that we tap into for sure. We ultimately, for our product in general, we use a lot of different sort of tools for depending on what the feature is, right? So the way that we construct things and bring them together and the LLMs we use kind of varies depending on what we do. In terms of service as a software, yeah, I mean, look, I think in this particular case, it's actually a really interesting workflow because it's one where historically it was either on the recruiter to kind of bring something to the table to the hiring manager. But, as a recruiter, I'm not an expert on every role. And it's really labor intensive to go do that work. Or it was on the hiring manager to do because they're theoretically the expert on the function, but they don't have a lot of time. And they're also not an expert. They might be an expert on that domain, but they're not an expert on like what are the skills and competencies required to be successful in every role in that domain. And so the way that we see that, that capability that we built use is actually collaboratively. That is the most common way that folks are using it. It's actually, we're going to get a conversation together, and then we're going to work through this workflow together. Because one, we'll be able to make conscious choices together. I can, as a recruiter, talk to you about the choices you're making and why they're more or less important, certain responsibilities or skills. And in turn, we're going to get it done really quickly. And I'm going to learn what you're actually looking for. Like I'm going to actually tease it out of you by the virtue of us going through this workflow together. So it is much more efficient, but it's not something that is taking the work off both people's, plate, and it's just automating it. It's actually making it really efficient, but it's actually an area where folks are collaborating, and it ends up being a really valuable interaction to set the stage for the rest of the process. Because now we have a much tighter conception of what we're looking for, a tighter assessment plan. We've actually worked through it. And as we go through the process, we can always go back to understand like the conversation we had about what actually matters and why and how we're going to assess for it. So it's not like a full automation in this particular workflow. It's actually like a collaboration tool that just makes the process much faster.
When I think about the evolution of tools in the recruiting space, there's a lot of talk about art and science. There seems to be a lot of science when it comes to recruiting and trying to crack the code on quality of hire. And skills-based hiring is back in our zeitgeist as competency-based interviewing was 10, 15, 20 years ago. When I think about scientific institutions, they're usually governed by a peer review process. Do you think there's truly a science to recruiting?
There's certainly a science to selection, but there's so many other, recruiting is a lot of things. It's not just selection. It's not just outreach or just selling or just the internal. The recruiting process is very broad. And so there is definitely science to recruiting or to the hiring process, let's call it. And there is a tremendous amount of art to it as well, right? At the end of the day, it's human. And, our point of view is, can we build technology that makes something that's very hard, just a very hard thing to do and do well, much, much easier, and help folks be more successful day in, day out while they're doing it. In particular, folks that don't do it all the time, right? So we have thousands of recruiters on Brighthire. They love the product and it helps them in a bunch of ways. It obviously saves them time. We do things like automating part of the workflow. It also helps them collaborate better. But we have tens of thousands, like a ton of folks that aren't recruiters on the platform. And for them, the hiring process is even harder because they do it less. It's not, and so they don't have a lot of reps. And so to answer your question, I think it's both. I think hiring is both. There's a science and there's an art. There's definitely a tremendous art to it as well. And I think technology, at least from our point of view, we are trying to build technology that makes people be more successful at something that's really hard and really important. So, and a lot of that is supporting them in, kind of the art side, right? How do they collaborate? How do they calibrate? How do they work together to get something done, work together to make a hire, to be successful, and facilitating that collaboration is definitely really important.
Do you think Brighthire can make recruiters more efficient in their workflow, or do you think it's to serve hiring managers to get them from those army of volunteers or sometimes focused on hiring folks into more of a service that can automate from the hiring manager seat to have more autonomy for that stakeholder? More specifically, replacing recruiters.
We're definitely not doing that. We definitely make recruiters much more efficient, like unquestionably. You go talk to our customers, our users, 100%. On the latter side, it's how do we equip hiring teams to be repeatably, basically higher performing and successful. We're also saving hiring teams time. That's why they love the product too. But it's how do we make hiring teams repeatably successful, consistent, more objective in their decision making so that we can scale excellence. Again, if you think about sales as a parallel, conversations really matter. The outcomes are really important. But the difference being everyone in sales is in sales. That's their job every day. And there's still tools that exist to help people and coach them and empower them to be great. Even more important in hiring, where the recruiting team is more akin to the sales team, right? It's their profession. They're doing it every day. So we're going to make them more efficient. We're going to enable them to be really successful. We're going to give them visibility. Like we empower recruiters with visibility into like their hiring teams and their hiring managers in a way that actually helps them consult because they actually know what's going on and what happened with candidates and so on and so forth. But it's even more important with the folks that aren't doing it every day, right? Because it's just so hard to hire if you don't do it. It's hard in general. It's hard if you don't do it frequently. So let's make it easier. Let's take away the cognitive load of interviewing. Let's allow you to focus. Let's give you perfect recall so you can check your biases and check your memory, right? Let's structure. When someone goes through an interview loop on Brighthire, candidates shared a lot of really important information. So we're going to frame that in a way that's really helpful to help you wrap your head around, like, what do we know? What do we not know? What have we heard? So ultimately, like, how do we help them?
I think that ties into what you mentioned about Brighthire being the first hiring excellence platform, being involved at every step of the hiring process, leveraging AI. When I think about the hiring process around objectivity, it is that hiring decision. Mm-hmm. Is there a ranking system that Brighthire puts on candidate finalists that says, so-and-so is a 3 versus so-and-so who is a 4?
No.
To inform that hiring decision?
We don't use AI to rank, score, stack rank candidates. What we do is we say, this candidate has shared a lot of really important information. We're going to try to clarify your decision-making process as much as possible and make it as objective and as informed as possible. So the way we do it is you say, this is what you care about. This is what you said was important for this role. Let's help you understand, what did you cover? What did you not cover? What's all the evidence, all the objective information this candidate shared about their qualifications that ties back to those things, and let's summarize them. Let's allow you to go back to any specific thing that ties out to a piece of feedback an interviewer gave in their feedback, or after the interview, really quickly and efficiently to gut check it, to revisit it. And so we actually frame that in as structured and kind of a clear way as possible. So a hiring team is making the most informed decision around the things that matter, but we are not giving a grade or a score to candidates using AI. We view our role as equipping hiring teams with as the best, most objective information that they can glean from interviews in a way that's going to be clarifying and hopefully result in just a higher conviction, higher confidence around the hiring decisions themselves.
I think I saw this visualized as like a percentage score on a horizontal bar chart to perhaps a specific competency. Is that quantitative metric aligned from an input the hiring manager says on the scorecard that Ben scored 4 out of 4 for a specific interview question? Or is Brighthire's LLM using some sort of semantic understanding of the oral inputs from the candidate to say, yes, this is the insight we gleaned for you, so that the hiring manager is told what competencies were surfaced?
So two things. One, the visual that you looked at might have been what we call our skills coverage report. So at a candidate level, what we're showing is literally, we're going to break down every competency or skill or responsibility that you say is important when you define the role. And you can edit this later, but we infer it automatically from your interview plan, your job description, so that it's automated, right? We want to make it easy. You can go in and edit it. And then we're looking at every interview that the candidate participated in and saying, was this covered? And how much? And how deeply? And we're actually just saying, this is, yes, you covered this competency a lot, somewhat, not at all. And so we're kind of eliminating that conversation that happens at the end of a lot of interview loops where it's like, did we cover, this salesperson's prospecting? Did anyone get to that? Because one of those gaps, if it's an important area, can be a mishire and also leads to a lot of sort of going in circles. So we're doing that. Then we're building a summary, essentially. We're saying, what did we learn from Ben across these 4 interviews as it relates to this area? And let's aggregate it in one place. So that's what we're doing at the candidate level. It's like a single pane of glass, and then you can actually query and say, did we cover X, or what do they say about Y, and pull more context automatically. The visual with the percentage completion, what I think you're referring to is, it's actually an insight. So as an organization, we want to say, run a consistent structured interview process. And maybe for same sales role, we have certain things that we think are really important, competencies, traits, skills. We can actually run a report and say, hey, we've had 100 candidates go through our full interview loop for this role. These are the things that we said mattered. How consistently are we doing that? Like, are we actually executing the plan or not? And so it allows you to actually measure the extent to which your teams are executing against the hiring plan. And you can do it for a specific role, or you can even do it across all roles. For instance, we have, company level values that we always want to assess for every candidate, regardless of role. We could run a report for every candidate that's finished our interview loop for those values and understand, like, is that happening consistently? Is it not? Where is it happening or not? So that's kind of what that.
Thank you for clarifying. Ben, this has been fantastic. There's nothing more valuable than founder time, so I appreciate you coming on. The last thing I'll say is you've mentioned objectivity, and Brighthire talks a little bit about equity and diversity and inclusion. When we think about the traditional sense of hiring, both you and your co-founder went to elite schools, worked in venture capital, consulting. Can you share a little bit about your commitment to diversity and what it means for you as you build this product?
Yeah, totally. Look, before I was like invested in the recruiting side of things, my first kind of like passion was like education and careers. It's like, how do folks find opportunity? And so as we built Brighthire, personally, we have to, eat our own dog food. So it's how do we make sure that as we are hiring and building our team, we are taking the approach that we've discussed. We're being focused on what are the skills, competencies, and traits that matter for our roles, and how do we widen the aperture as much as possible to build an organization that's not just based on, I went to 4-year college, so did my co-founder, but that actually doesn't make us more qualified for, than someone who didn't. At the end of the day, it's about, do you have the tools and the capabilities? And so it's just about having a commitment day in, day out for our own hiring. It's about making sure we build a product responsibly. So that's a really big part of it as well. Putting our product through actual paces in terms of what is the impact and how does it vary based on who the candidate is and their background, and making sure that anything that we ship, we are accountable to and responsible for. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be part of a really important process that's going to impact people's outcomes. And so we don't want to put anything out into the world and put it into our clients' hands until we've validated that it's going to be fair and equitable, regardless of candidate, and that, it deserves to be part of a hiring process. And I think that's one thing that gets lost sometimes, which is, recruiting technology is very important. It's a part of a very important process that shapes really important outcomes. And so your technology has to deserve to be a part of the hiring process, because if it's not built responsibly and you're not accountable, it can have a really, negative impact, just as it can have a very positive impact. So, I think it's both how we hire, what values we uphold, but also sort of the bar that we hold ourselves to in terms of the technology that we're going to put in our clients' hands. And we take that really seriously.
That actually makes me think of one last question I'd love to get your thoughts on. I don't expect any one researcher or any one vendor to get skills-based hiring right. There's no one right way to hire. There's no recruiting emergency room or recruiting jail. Hiring is far too vast for there to be one size fits all solutioning. But say we do get all of the variables of skills-based hiring correct. The controllables operate within this vacuum of perfect hiring, and we go through the entire loop. And then maybe at the end of the process, the candidate reveals that they went to Berkeley, or their dad founded a software company in the exact same, product market. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. How do you think about some of those traditional signifiers of experience and skills and qualification, even if we get this right?
I don't think that, we should view traditional signifiers or skills and qualifications in a negative light, right? That person may have worked really hard and, and if they're part of a family where they were fortunate, we shouldn't hold that against them. At the end of the day, it's, can we make sure that everyone that's going through an assessment process is going through the same process? That process is as objective as possible, that it's really oriented around what is required to be successful and not other things. If somebody reveals that they're part of, went to a 4-year institution, or, their parents are famous or not, it's kind of irrelevant at the end of the day. Neither should be held against somebody at the end of the day. But the thing we can control is, to your point, the actual process itself. How do we evaluate? How do we decision make? And do we make that as consistent and objective as possible? Is that what you were getting at? Or, yeah, I'm curious. What's
Yeah,
your point of view?
absolutely. I think it's fascinating when we insert equity and inclusion into skills-based hiring for removing those traditional signifiers of, somebody worked at, Big Four accounting firm. It's focusing on the outcomes of the job and understanding what can that person do for that organization. And as the skills in the market are recalibrated and revalued through the ups and downs, it really comes down to individual motivations. And that's why I pressed a little around this idea of science and psychology and post hire outcomes, and even the idea of divergence. I think it's fascinating subject that we're exploring, vendors, consultants, analysts, practitioners. And as long as we continue to have these conversations, we're moving in the right direction. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate you showing up for the recruiting community, your Shine community, your conference. How can people stay up to date with you and where Brighthire will be in 2025?
As you mentioned, I share a lot on LinkedIn. I'm always sharing kind of what we're working on, products that we're building, and also we try to share insights as much as possible. So we're fortunate to have a bunch of really interesting data around hiring and the interview process, and we try to capture the learnings from that and share it as much as possible. So you can follow me, follow Brighthire on LinkedIn. We'll do another conference this coming year, and we do have a community called Shine. So definitely reach out to join that. And likewise, appreciate everything that you're doing. Super thoughtful questions. I appreciate you having me. And yeah, I think we have there's a long way to go, I think, for driving exceptional hiring. And there is not one solution. It's not one tool that's going to solve all your problems. So the part that we try to play is, we're going to do interviews. We're going to have an interview process. So how do we make it as great as possible? But there's a lot of other pieces that you have to get right as well to ultimately be exceptional and execute on, whether it's skills-based hiring or otherwise. So hopefully we're playing a small role in that, and we're really excited about some of the progress we made. But there's a long way to go.
Well, thanks, Ben. We'll see you out there this year on the tour.
I will be there.